So for this next little section, we want to talk about exposure. And essentially, exposure for video is going to be very similar to exposure for photography. You basically have three things that are going to determine your exposure. It's going to be your shutter speed, your ISO, and your aperture. So let's break down each one of these components so that you understand how they work and how you can set them correctly to get the best exposure in each particular scene. So let's first talk about your shutter. Basically, your shutter is going to work very similarly with video as it does with still photographs. And essentially what your shutter is doing is it's controlling the amount of time you let light enter into your camera and your lens and then hit your sensor. So imagine this, imagine you have a water spigot with a hose on it. The diameter of the hose is going to be the aperture, which we'll talk about in a minute, but the amount of time that you leave the water spigot turned on is going to be your shutter. So if you have a very fast shutter, your shutter is going to open and shut really quickly and let very little bit of light come through, whereas if you have a long shutter, it's going to be open, which will allow much more light to enter into the camera. Now, unlike a digital camera that has a physical curtain and shutter built into it, on most video cameras, you're going to have a curtain that opens up, but then your shutter is actually going to work electronically. So instead of having a curtain that goes up and down and a shutter that's physically moving, your sensor is just going to turn itself on and turn itself off depending on what actual shutter speed you have chosen. Now with video, we typically film in 24 frames per second, but it's important to remember that that is the frame rate. That's not actually the shutter. So in 1 second of video footage, you're going to have 24 frames within that 1 second. And the shutter speed for those 24 frames could be anything from 1/25th of a second all the way up to, say, 1/1000th of a second. If you're locked into 24 frames per second, you're not going to be able to have a slower shutter speed than 1/24 or 1/25 typically with most cameras. But if you want to capture really fast moving objects, you can set your shutter really high, especially if you're outside in really bright situations. Now there is one caveat here. There are a few cameras that allow you to do video time lapse where you actually can choose a shutter speed that's much longer than 1/25th of a second. Now if you notice that you're filming video and you've chosen a shutter speed that's slower than 1/25th of a second, when you go back and play it on your computer, you're going to notice that it's really choppy and it's going to look more like stop motion. Now later in this tutorial, we're going to start changing our frame rate to much higher frame rates like 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second. So it's important to remember that you're going to want your shutter speed to be at least as fast as your frame rate, if not even faster. So what is the difference when you have a shutter speed of, say, 1/25th of a second or something that is shot at 1/1000th of a second? Well, basically, as a fast-moving object moves through your frame, if you have a slower shutter, you're going to get a nice blur in every single one of those frames that makes up the 24 frames per second. This looks very natural to our eyes, and when you have things moving quickly, it gives that nice little blur that kind of blends together, and it's a pretty pleasing effect. If you have something moving really quickly through your frame, and you shoot at a higher shutter speed, like 1/1000th of a second, every single time you pause that video, you're going to have a nice crisp image. And when you play that back in 24 frames per second, it might be a little more jarring, it might be a little more off-putting. It doesn't quite look as natural as something that's got that slight motion blur. Now I'm going to play these two clips side by side so you can see them loop over and over so you can really see the details of this. But basically the shot on the left is going to have the slower shutter speed, where the shot on the right is going to have a much faster shutter speed. And it may be hard to tell the difference for you, but if you're really keen to this and you're looking at video footage all the time, you're going to notice this much faster shutter speed on the right, and it just doesn't look quite as natural. Now, if you were filming some kind of action movie, or next time you're in a theater and you see an action flick, you'll notice that a lot of directors choose to do a really fast shutter speed so they can get that jarring effect. So you can definitely use this as a creative decision, but typically you're going to want to use the slowest shutter speed possible. When you start getting into videography, you're going to hear a lot of DPs, a lot of videographers, a lot of people that produce content talk about the 180 shutter rule. And basically the idea here is that you want to choose a shutter speed that is twice the speed of your frame rate. Now if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you would want to double the 24 so that you get 48, and that would be your shutter, 1/48th of a second. Most of our cameras don't have a shutter speed that's actually 1/48th of a second, so we would round that up to 1/50th of a second. This is basically the 180 rule. Now, the 180-degree shutter got its name from when cameras had rotary shutters, and these rotary shutters would have a notch carved out of them, and those notches would determine how much light was actually exposed to the single frame of film. If a rotary shutter had a larger notch cut out of it, the exposure times would be greater, and as we know, with larger exposure times, you could actually introduce more motion blur. So the big thing to remember is 180 degrees is going to be twice your frame rate. You should definitely memorize that. But then if you go faster, if you go to a 90-degree shutter, you're actually going to have a much faster shutter speed, which is going to give you that really jarring effect. If we go the other way to like a 270-degree shutter, that's going to be even slower. So you might be shooting at 1/25th of a second, 1/30th of a second. It's going to be much closer to the actual frame rate that you're shooting at. For us personally, we like to shoot with slower shutters if possible, so a lot of times we'll set our camera all the way to 1/25th of a second. You'll find that shooting with a really slow shutter speed can be really helpful when you're shooting with fluorescent lights that have that flicker. Making your shutter speed even longer is going to help eliminate that, which can be really distracting in your footage. So the big takeaway from all of this is typically we do not walk around and talk about 180-degree shutters or 90-degree shutters. We just basically set the shutter speed as slow as we possibly can with the given situation that we're in. And then we try to get a slower shutter speed to kind of blur the motion in the scene. Or if it's really bright outside, we sometimes have to bump that up and choose a much faster shutter. But I definitely want you guys to understand how the shutter works so that when you make these artistic decisions, you can either choose the slower shutter speed or a fast shutter speed depending on the aesthetic you're trying to achieve. Now before we move on to the other elements that control exposure, I do want to mention one other thing. When you're out in really bright sunlight, sometimes you're going to find that it's near impossible to get a slow shutter speed without overexposing your scene. And the only real way to get around that is by using neutral density filters. That's going to block a lot of light coming into your lens, and it's going to allow you to keep your shutter speed relatively slow while still shooting in really bright sunlight. The next way to control your overall exposure is by changing the ISO on your camera. Now, your ISO is basically the setting that determines how sensitive the sensor in your camera is towards light. Traditionally, with film, you used to have 100 or 200 speed film, and you really couldn't change the sensitivity of the film that was in your camera. But now with digital cameras, this is all controlled digitally, so you literally can shoot one scene at 100 ISO and completely change your settings to shoot a scene that might require ISO 3200. This is super convenient, and you're going to be changing your ISO all the time when you're shooting video. Now you can really set your ISO to whatever setting you want depending on the scene that you're shooting in. The general rule is you're going to want to set your ISO as low as possible. That's going to give you the cleanest looking footage. So if you're outside and it's super bright, you might want to shoot at ISO 100. If your camera goes below that, you might want to set it to ISO 64 or even ISO 32. As you transition into scenes that might be indoors or at night, you're going to find that you need to bump your ISO to maybe ISO 1600, 3200, and some of these cameras go up as high as 6400 or even higher. Now, you're definitely going to start to introduce noise into your footage as you get into the higher ISOs, but sometimes that's the only thing that you can do to capture the scene correctly. So that you can really see how much noise can be introduced into these cameras at higher ISOs, here's a few different examples of the exact same exposure, but as you can see, as we increase the ISO and go up from 800 to 1600 to 3200, there's a lot more noise introduced into the shadows compared to the original footage shot at ISO 100. Now, a lot of filmmakers, a lot of purists are going to talk about using native ISOs only. And basically what a native ISO is that each camera manufacturer has designed the sensor for that camera to perform perfectly at a specific ISO. If you have a Nikon camera like this, it might be at ISO 64. If you have a GH5, it might be at ISO 600. Basically, if you set your camera to its native ISO, you're going to be getting the cleanest signal possible. In many cases, all of the other ISOs are generated by either decreasing the signal digitally or amplifying it digitally, and that process introduces a little bit of noise. Now, for the videos that we produce, like this tutorial or things that we put up on YouTube or on Facebook, in many cases the compression and the algorithms are going to add more noise to it anyway, and so it's not a huge deal if we set our cameras to the native ISO or if we just arbitrarily choose the ISO that we think we need in that situation. But if you were, say, shooting in RAW or you're preparing to film a feature movie, you might really want to lock your camera into that native ISO so that you get the absolute cleanest footage possible. Like I said, every single camera is going to have its own unique sensor, and so you really need to look this up to figure out what the native ISO is for your camera. Also keep in mind, a lot of videographers might buy two completely different camera systems because one is kind of catered towards shooting in really low ISO and bright light, or another camcorder might be catered towards shooting at a higher native ISO so you can get really clean footage in low light. Overall, the ISO isn't going to change the aesthetic of your footage very much, so for me, I like to set that first. I like to set that as low as I possibly can, and then from there I'm going to choose my aperture or my shutter so that I can get the exact look that I want. So the third and final way that we can control our exposure is by using the aperture on our lens. Now, in the water hose example I used back with the shutter speed, the aperture is essentially going to be the diameter of the hose. So if you have a really small hose, you're going to let very little water through, even if you left it open for a long period of time. But if you could increase the diameter of that hose to something much larger, you're going to allow a lot more water to pass through. The exact same thing applies to your lens. So if you had a large aperture lens like 1.4 or 2.8, you're going to allow a lot more light to pass through that lens compared to a small aperture at say f8 or f16. This gets a little bit confusing because you think of a wide open aperture with a small number and a small aperture with a large number, but that's kind of the nature of f-stops. Now, when you start talking about apertures with video, you're going to hear a lot of people talk about f-stops, but they're also going to mention t-stops. These are two different nomenclatures. If you're coming from the photography world, you're probably very familiar with f-stops, but if you jump into the video world, you're probably going to hear people talk a lot more about t-stops. So exactly what is the difference here? Well, it's basically just the way that we measure the amount of light that passes through a lens. With an f-stop, you're basically using the focal length and a mathematical equation to come up with a general rule on how much light comes through, whereas a t-stop is the actual measured amount of light that passes through the lens. So what's interesting about this is if you take two identical lenses from the same manufacturer that are both set at say f2.8, you're actually going to get a slight variation of light that passes through those aperture blades and hits your sensor. But if you have a lens that's measured in t-stops, those lenses have been designed to allow the exact same amount of light to pass through, no matter which lens it is, which manufacturer, or which focal length. For the sake of this tutorial, we're going to mention everything in f-stops and not t-stops, so if you're coming from the photography world, we're just going to mention that this lens is a 2.8 lens, or a 1.4 lens, or a variable aperture lens. We're not going to get into t-stops. We're going to really cater this towards photographers. So now that we've talked a little bit about how we measure the amount of light coming through the aperture, let's talk about exactly what the aperture does to your footage. In my opinion, your aperture is going to have much more of an artistic impact on your footage compared to your ISO or your shutter speed. Basically, your aperture is going to allow you to control the depth of field in your scene. So that means you can focus, say, on me and completely blur everything out behind me, or you could set your aperture much smaller and increase your depth of field so that much more of your scene is in focus. Having a fast lens that gives you that shallow depth of field is going to be really handy when you want to blur the background and bring all of the attention to your subject. But it's also sometimes nice to stop down and shoot at f8 if you want the entire scene nice and sharp. In terms of getting a correct exposure, you can really set your aperture to anything, but the aperture is going to have a huge effect on how the actual footage looks in terms of the depth of field and the blurriness of the background. The second most important thing about your aperture doesn't have to necessarily do with depth of field, but it has to do with the amount of light hitting your sensor. As we just talked about with ISO, in many cases you're going to find yourself shooting video clips in low light and you're going to have to bump your ISO really, really high to get a correct exposure. If you have a faster aperture lens, you can lower your ISO and open the aperture of your lens so you can get more light hitting the sensor, which will produce both a cleaner looking image and also a more shallow depth of field indoors. As you can see in this example here, the footage on the left has been shot at f1.4. We've been able to keep our ISO relatively low, which has created a nice clean image. But the video on the right, we had to shoot at f5.6, which as you can see is underexposed, the ISO is much higher, and it's very, very grainy. So if you're looking to film, let's say, a wedding, and it's turned into the wedding reception, the lighting's really low, you're gonna have a hard time getting good footage if your lens does not have a fast aperture. So it really pays to buy a great lens with a fast aperture. Not only is it going to allow you to film usable footage, but that footage is going to be much cleaner because you're going to be able to keep your ISO relatively low. Now, of course, fast aperture lenses cost a lot more. These are going to be much greater investments than just buying a cheap lens that has a fixed aperture or variable aperture of, say, 5.6. But like I said, it's really, really valuable to have that 1.4 or 2.8 aperture so that you can not only control the depth of field, but you can also shoot in much lower light situations. So that's basically it. You have your shutter speed, you have your ISO, and you have your aperture. And together, all three of those are going to help determine not only your correct exposure, but also the artistic vision of your footage. So if you use your aperture wide open, you're gonna get that shallow depth of field look. If you use a slower shutter speed, you're gonna get that nice motion blur. And of course, you're gonna also wanna shoot with the lowest ISO possible so that your footage is as clean as possible.